Well, good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, and we'd like to welcome you to our second live question and answer session for the cigarette tax stamping process. We are welcoming your questions today. I'm Carrie Walker, VACo Coordinator of Programs and Development, and it's wonderful to see everyone. We'd like to welcome Alex Spelman, Vice President of Business Development at SICPA. Alex will guide us through the tax stamping process today and answer any specific questions that you may have. We would also like to welcome Katie Boyle, our VACo Director of Government Affairs. Katie is on our VACo legislative team, and she worked on the cigarette tax stamping legislation last year. She can field any legislative questions that you have for us today. We are recording our session, and we will add it to our VACo cigarette tax toolkit page on our website. We'll post the link to the website and also provide you with Alex, Katie's, and my contact information in case you need it. If you would be so kind as to remain muted unless you would like to unmute and ask a question, we would really appreciate that. If you prefer to ask a question in the chat, please go ahead and type it in and we will read it for you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Alex from SICPA. Alex, we appreciate you taking the time today, and we look forward to your feedback. The platform is yours.
Thank you, Carrie, and welcome everyone. I'm Alexander Spelman. I'm Vice President of Business Development for SICPA-Meyercord Revenue. I'm joined today by two colleagues, Alberto de la Serna and Cara Parga. A little bit of the background on SICPA-Meyercord Revenue. We are the current tax stamp provider to the Commonwealth of Virginia Department of Taxation. In that contract, we provide taxation with its stamps for cigarette packs that are distributed and sold within the Commonwealth, as well as a stamp that is jointly issued by the Department of Taxation and the Northern Virginia Cigarette Tax Board. We also provide cigarette tax stamps to currently authorized jurisdictions, cities, and towns within the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as to 43 other states here in the United States and roughly 180 local jurisdictions throughout the US that are also authorized to administer and collect cigarette excise taxes. So we really do appreciate the opportunity to answer any questions that the group has. We had previously issued a pre-recorded video, Carrie, which I believe is available on the VACo site, providing an overview of cigarette tax stamping. What are tax stamps? How do they work? How do wholesalers order and apply stamps to cigarette packs? And what are some of the process considerations that stamping jurisdictions have regarding the management of tax stamp processes, the enforcement of local cigarette tax stamp statutes, and some of the tools that can support those capabilities as you move forward with the authorization for local stamping programs. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone in the audience may have in regards to tax stamping. And I'll just jump right in and say, the floor is open. And please feel free to ask any questions you may have. I can certainly go through any presentation points to clarify anything that's out there.
Alex, this is Katie Boyle with VACo, and maybe I'll just throw a question out to get us started, if that would be okay.
Of course.
So just sort of, if maybe you could kind of refresh folks on sort of the process. So supposing, a county's deciding that they'd like to move forward with implementing the new cigarette tax authority. So they would be in touch with you all about the mechanics, setting up the stamp. And so what would that process look like, and sort of how much time would you all need to kind of get the implementation up and running after a county is first in touch with you?
Sure. So maybe what I'll do is, why don't I share my screen and I can show a couple of slides that'll add some context on that that we gave as part of the webinar. So please let me know if you can all see my screen. So Virginia has several different levels of cigarette excise tax collection. There's the state program, and then there are local programs. And so one of the challenges in Virginia is to ensure that the stamping agents who are required to apply stamps are able to do so with a consistent stamp type. the way the process works today is the wholesaler distributor of the cigarette products is required to apply the stamp, and by doing so, pay the appropriate tax or register there will be a tax payment by applying the stamp to the pack of cigarettes. The stamping agents do that using a variety of high-speed application equipment. And then for certain packs that are not standard sized, they will apply the tax stamps by hand. And so you have very, very high volumes of stamp application that need to be supported, so there isn't an adverse impact to wholesaler operations in terms of the distribution of cigarette products to retailers throughout the Commonwealth. So within the Code of Virginia statutes, there's actually a requirement that any stamp that is used to support local ordinances must use the same technology as the state stamp. And the idea for that was to make sure that the wholesalers only had to manage one type of stamp in a consistent form and format. They weren't going to have lots of different processes to support stamping at the various levels of taxation throughout the Commonwealth. To give everyone a quick little primer on the cigarette tax stamps, the state currently uses what we call a thermal tax stamp. So a thermal tax stamp is essentially applied to a pack of cigarettes via a combination of heat and pressure. For lack of a better term, it's fused on to the pack of cigarette polypropylene packaging. And so the stamping agent uses a high volume machining that does that at a rate of somewhere between 60 and 90 cartons a minute for the vast majority of cigarettes. And the stamps are provided in formats of rolls that can be mounted on those machines and very efficiently and quickly applied to various cartons of cigarettes as they move through the transport mechanism of the machine. In terms of the types of stamps that are currently used, as I said, there are several levels of taxation within the Commonwealth. I'm giving you examples of the current state stamps. So there's a state 20 stamp, which goes on packs of cigarettes containing 20 sticks. There's also a state 25 stamp that's required to be applied on packs of cigarettes with 25 sticks. However, at this point, manufacturers are no longer producing those types that at least we've seen in the market for the past several years. So at this point, stamping is really on the state 20 types in the current environment. There's also a joint stamp that the state issues in conjunction with the Northern Virginia Cigarette Tax Board. And what that does is instead of a wholesaler have to apply one stamp for the state, one stamp for the NVCTB, instead of two stamps, you're able just to apply one stamp that covers both jurisdictions from a tax compliance perspective. And I believe with the authorization for counties, there is also language for that to be allowed should there be boards formed in addition to NVCTB that local jurisdictions wish to join for administration of local cigarette excise stamping. We currently provide two different stamps for local jurisdictions, so municipalities, cities, and towns. We have what we call a generic stamp design, and you'll see the example down here. And it's a generic stamp because the base design of the stamp is the same for each jurisdiction that uses it. So every jurisdiction that uses our generic municipal stamp, it'll say municipal tax paid, and it will say cigarettes, and it will have this design. What we can do with the generic stamp, however, is we can personalize in this space right here a code, an abbreviation, something that tells a jurisdiction it's their version of the generic stamp versus somebody else's. So it could be, the zip code of the locality. It could be an abbreviation of the name of the locality. That allows that stamp to be identified as being issued under the authority of that locality, but still use a general design. And the reason we have the generic stamp is we have many jurisdictions that have very, very small volumes of annual activity. And so it allows us to provide the stamps at a lower cost point than a custom stamp would otherwise provide for. We do have the ability to provide a custom design stamp for local jurisdictions or for boards if that is something that is desired. You can see some examples here, and these can contain lots of different graphical representations, different colors, different features that are visually available that can help differentiate a cigarette tax stamp from one jurisdiction to another. And that is ultimately really the core requirement of a tax stamp. You want to make sure that you have the ability when you're at a retailer to know that the pack has the appropriate tax paid for the jurisdiction that it's in, and therefore you need a mechanism in some way, shape, or form to be able to quickly and efficiently identify that this is a tax stamp that our jurisdiction has issued, and it has been placed on a product that is being sold in our jurisdiction, so that we don't have movements of products between jurisdictions because of variances in tax rates or other statutory limitations. In terms of the stamp itself, and I apologize, I'm going quickly here. For counties, we're going to make available both a generic county stamp as well as a custom stamp. So you can see here is the proposed design on the top for our generic county stamp. As I referenced before, we have a space where we can personalize it. So where it says VACoX, that is a personalization that could read for a county. So an abbreviation of the county name, some other identifier that makes that generic stamp specific to a jurisdiction. And then we will also have a role ID on there. And we put the role ID on there to give the jurisdictions control and traceability on the stamp. So when a stamp is ordered by a wholesaler from the jurisdiction, we can record the role ID. The jurisdiction can record the role ID depending on the distribution method of which stamp is going to which wholesaler. So when you see that at retail and are doing an inspection, you can look at that role ID and say, okay, I know I sold this to McLean. I know I sold this to Hackney or some other distributor. And is that distributor the appropriate distributor for that retailer? For the custom county stamp, you can see we have a lot of different capabilities visually available in the stamp. From a timeline perspective, Katie, we typically require between 45 and 60 days to produce a tax stamp for the first time. So we do have some lead time from our production perspective to make sure that we've worked with each jurisdiction. What type of tax stamp do you want to use? The generic version? Do you want a custom stamp? If it's custom, what kind of design? We'll work with you on the artwork of that to come up with a design that's going to be unique and differentiated from stamps that are used in your general proximity, and make sure it's not something that would be confused with a state stamp or another jurisdictional issue stamp. And once we get the artwork approved, we then go into production and we will produce the stamps. Stamps will be provided both for the generic and the custom stamps on rolls of 30,000 stamps or 15,000 stamps. These are the standard roll sizes that are currently in use across the state and by taxation, and allows for the conformity of the stamps to the existing equipment and processes used by wholesalers to apply stamps to packs of cigarettes. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that was very thorough and helpful. If I might follow up just while people are sort of thinking about their questions. Last General Assembly session, there was a lot of discussion about regional tax administration versus counties implementing independently. And, in our conversations with our members, some counties are planning to implement on their own. Some counties are talking about regional approaches. There's, a new regional board being formed in the Mount Rogers Planning District area. So there's kind of different approaches here. So could you talk a little bit about how you would work with an independent jurisdiction or jurisdiction implementing independently versus a regional body?
Yeah, certainly. So we actually have many contracts directly with local jurisdictions for the provision of tax stamps today. As I referenced before, we also hold the contract with the State Department of Taxation. My understanding of the enabling legislation was that it does allow for boards to be formed. And if those boards are formed, they actually also have the opportunity to discuss with taxation, issuing a joint stamp similar to what NVCTB does. And I believe actually the Mount Rogers, may be going in that direction. But we can contract directly with the jurisdiction if they're going to remain, an individual jurisdiction from a taxing perspective. And we can provide either the generic or the custom stamp under a direct agreement with that jurisdiction. I think we've got roughly 100 jurisdictions today that we do that with. If there's a board that is formed, then we would work with the board to design the stamp. And if it were to flow through the contract with taxation, for example, we would then add that to the inventory of tax stamps under the taxation contract at their authorization. So the contracting method could be directly with a jurisdiction, it could be directly with a board, or it could be through the authorization of taxation for a joint stamp that they will do with a board construct.
Alex, there's a question in the chat. On the generic stamps, the roll ID is keeping track of each stamp, or would we have to have a custom stamp to keep track of each stamp?
So that's a great question. On the generic stamp, it's only going to keep track of which roll the stamp was on. So yeah, as I said, rolls will have either 30,000 or 15,000 stamps on them. So in the case of a generic stamp, there will be essentially 15,000 or 30,000 instances of a stamp that will have the same roll ID on them. On the custom stamp, we add the feature, what we call unique ID of a stamp. So in the custom stamp that you can see, the top 5 numbers are the roll ID. The bottom 5 numbers become the positioning of the stamp on the roll. And the reason we can do that on the custom stamp is on the generic stamp, we have to use the top 5 alpha characters to provide the specific identification of the jurisdiction, because the design of the stamp is going to be the same. With a custom stamp, because each design is going to be unique and different, we no longer have to do the denoting of the jurisdiction because that's in the design itself. So we add this additional sequence ID, and that 10-digit combination on the custom stamp actually then uniquely serializes each stamp. So in this case, if I looked at this custom stamp, this would tell me that this stamp is part of roll ID 3452. And this is stamp position 19,508 on that roll. This would be the only stamp that would have that 10-digit serialization on it. If the next stamp that would be applied would be 3452 19509. So yes, with the custom stamp, we can actually create a unique 10-digit serialization that is specific to one stamp and one stamp only. With the generic ones, we do provide the roll ID, but there is going to be a recurrence of that roll ID either 15,000 or 30,000 times, depending on the size of the roll.
Thank you, Alex. Another question has just come up in the chat. Why doesn't the state just add the tax and share it with the counties via a revenue sharing program?
Well, I honestly, Carrie, I'm going to defer that back to you because I think that's more of a policy question. And I will leave it to you to comment on that.
Well, I can offer a little bit. This is Katie Boyle with VACo again. You know, when the authorization legislation was moving forward in 2020, you know, what VACo had argued for years was that that counties were providing essentially the same services as cities and towns, and that we should have the same taxing authority. And so that was not just for cigarette taxes, that was for meals taxes, admissions, transient occupancy taxes, et cetera. And so the construct that we were working within was, you know, cities and towns have the ability to impose these taxes at local option, so counties should also have that authority. There was some discussion last summer in a working group that was put together to talk about kind of the streamlining the process of administering the tax. There was a little bit of discussion about the state administering the local tax on behalf of the localities, you know, sort of like the state would be collecting sales tax and then remitting it back. I think there would be a lot of, I mean, you know, it could be done, but I think the state would have to take on quite a bit of enforcement costs. And I just don't think that was considered feasible at the time. I think there were sort of differing, we kind of surveyed our membership, and I think there were differing schools of thought on whether our folks wanted the state to kind of handle the local administration on behalf of localities, or whether localities wanted to handle it themselves and sort of be more in control of the enforcement. So kind of a long answer to a short question, but hopefully that helps.
That's a great question.
Thank you, Katie. Alex, there's another question. How many tax stamps must be applied to a pack of cigarettes?
So that depends on the jurisdiction, and whether or not there is currently a local tax that is authorized. At the current time, there could be up to 2 stamps that are required to be applied to a pack of cigarettes. So the state stamp is always required. And then it's a question of which local jurisdiction the product's intended to be retailed in and whether that jurisdiction requires a stamp or not. In the case of a jurisdiction that's currently in the NVCTB, because the state and the NVCTB have a joint stamp, you still only require 1 stamp because the 1 stamp supports both the state as well as the NVCTB. If it was a city, it would be a state stamp and the city stamp. If it's an individual county, it will be the state stamp plus the county stamp. My understanding is also with the enabling authorization that there is the opportunity where there are cities and townships within a county that there could be some mutual authorization to collect taxes, but that would be purely on a voluntary basis between the jurisdictions. If that was the case, then it would be conceivable that you could have a state, a county, and a city, township, municipality stamp all required on a pack, but that is not what is currently required today.
Thank you, Alex.
Yep.
Alex, can you think of some other details that you might include this morning that might be on people's minds, maybe some things they haven't thought of yet?
Sure. And I think, you know, I put up a slide here that sort of looks at the overall impact of what we would call cigarette tax management. And I think it's important to understand that the tax stamps alone are just a tool, but they're not the end all of a effective excise tax compliance program. Right. So there are some critical questions as you stand up an excise tax program that you will need capabilities to answer. Right. So the area of licensing, who is required to pay the tax? Do I have a registration of those entities? Do I know where they are, what they're doing? The ordering of tax stamps, right? So I have to have tax stamps available for wholesalers to use. So what is my process going to be? Not only just to make sure I'm acquiring the stamps from Meyercord Revenue, but do I want to inventory those stamps at a premise within my jurisdiction? If I'm inventorying those stamps, I have to secure them because they are, you know, worth taxable value. And at 30,000 stamps per roll, even at a 40 cents per pack value, you know, you're looking at nearly $13,000, $12,000 of taxable value on each roll of tax stamps. So they have to be secured. They then have to be fulfilled to the wholesaler, whether the wholesaler is going to walk in, whether you're going to mail them or FedEx them or some other form of delivery to the wholesaler. And you have to reconcile those tax stamps, make sure that none are being misplaced, they're not being lost or stolen, and that you have that tracking on all the inventory that you have in your location, as well as visibility to all the rolls that have been distributed. You'll have to support the stamping process, right? So as wholesalers apply stamps, you know, consideration of things of what constitutes a good, if you will, application of a tax stamp. You know, the tax stamp, by its very nature of application, right? Heat and pressure. There's always going to be some impact to the tax stamp. A little piece will flake off. There might be a little bit of a rough edge because that's just the nature of the process. We refer to this as what we call de minimis standards. What constitutes a good stamp? Or how much of the stamp needs to be applied and legible and visible for it to be considered a legitimate application, so that when you see that at a retailer in your jurisdiction, you will look at that and say, that is a valid stamp. It's been applied in good faith versus one that looks like someone may have tried to game the system, if you will. Because we do see, you know, in the past, you know, stamping agents will take one stamp and try to apply it to 2 packs, half and half, to try to, you know, avoid the full, you know, tax impact on those products. The distribution of the revenues, if you're going to be on a board especially, and there are variances between the tax rates that the various members of the board are going to apply, either because not everybody wants to start at the 40-cent maximum authorization, or because you're going to incorporate in entities that already have authorization and have higher tax rates that are grandfathered in. How does all that revenue get effectively counted for if you're all using the same stamp? So that each jurisdiction gets its tax revenue based on the rate and volume that are appropriate to them within the board construct. And then how are you going to support inspections and field audit of this activity so that you can make determinations that all the products that are being distributed and sold in your jurisdiction are being appropriately stamped? They're being stamped with your jurisdictional stamp. There's not a diversion of products from a zero tax or lower tax nearby jurisdiction into those retailers. And there's not a tax avoidance that is going on. So there are a lot of different considerations that go around the tax stamp that I would just encourage you to think about as you're setting these programs up. We certainly have solutions that encompass the variety of these different types of capabilities. The one that I would point out and that we've discussed with several jurisdictions is what we call our stamp ordering service. We call this direct to distributor. As I referenced, right, it's not just the acquisition of tax stamps, but it's the fulfillment of tax stamps. How do I get those out to the distributors and stamping agents that need them? We can virtualize that entire process and make that electronic. So we will produce stamps on your behalf. We will store stamps on your behalf. You never have to worry about stamps running out, or, oh my gosh, I forgot to reorder stamps and I only have a couple of cases left. What do I do? We will maintain inventories always sufficient on your behalf for orders. And we will provide you with a fulfillment service where orders that come in and that you approve will automatically be shipped by us directly to the wholesale location. And we will give you full insight and reporting on which rolls have gone to which location, as well as provide the wholesaler that orders the stamps visibility into the tracking of that delivery to them. So it's a very streamlined process. We currently do this with 15 states today. We ship a little over 4.5 billion stamps used on cigarette packs this way. And it's certainly an offering we can make available to jurisdictions as they consider setting up stamping programs.
An additional question would be, can the generic stamps have a background color as shown on the slide, unique to a locality? Clear backgrounds are difficult to differentiate without close inspection.
So that is the challenge of the nature of something being deemed generic, right? That's it's a consistent common design. And the reason why we do this offering is because we can produce things at a very high scale. And the more scale we get, the more efficiency we get, we can pass those cost savings on to our customers. So with a generic stamp, we design this to be one version, one background color, one consistent visual design of the stamp to be able to pass cost savings on to our customers by being able to produce those in much larger quantities than an individual jurisdiction might need. If there are requirements for different colors or different background elements, that would then move us into the custom stamp. We are looking at the potential, I'm going to say this again, potential of whether or not we could offer 2 or 3 color versions of a generic stamp, and what the cost impact of that would be for us, because we do recognize that when you're going to be getting very proximate jurisdictions, that visual offset is important. When you look at a tax stamp, from an inspection perspective, you want to look at a rack of cigarettes at a retailer. You need to be able to see it at some degree of distance that there's a stamp on the product and that it at least visually conforms to the standards for your stamp. Then obviously you'll do further interrogation close in on the stamp as needed. So we are looking at that, but as of now, right now, the generic stamp is designed to be something that is a standard color background, visual design pattern, and that if there's a need for specific colors or visuals, that would be a custom stamp.
Thank you. We'd like to open the floor to any additional questions. We do have a comment in the chat. I'm concerned about the impact on the Commissioner of Revenue Office to implement a cigarette tax. Are there services offered to assist with registration or audit compliance that would be available rather than hiring additional staff in the Commissioner of Revenue office? The program should be easier to administer after the initial implementation in subsequent years.
So if I understand the question there, that sounds like there's a mix of what sort of information technology assets do we need to be able to register and oversee the stamping activity, right? Whether it's the wholesalers or the retailers. But that also sounded like there may be a need for some staff augmentation, the actual provision of a couple of inspectors who can conduct that activity. We can certainly provide, the infrastructure to manage the end-to-end stamping process, as I showed you on this slide. We have tools for licensing, for managing stamp orders, for reconciling stamping activity, taking in the reports that you may require from various stamping agents or retailers that we'll use to reconcile against, say, the stamping order activity, and field tools that can be used. We currently do not provide, though, a staff augmentation where we can actually do the inspection services on your behalf. So, we certainly have a broad variety of tool sets we can go into greater detail on with you, and my contact information, I believe, is in the chat, and please feel free to reach out. In terms of the staff side, Carrie, I'm not really sure where to direct that question. That might be something that perhaps you could facilitate either with the state or NVCTB and how they've managed those processes from their end.
Thank you, Alex. Are there any other questions or comments today? I know this has been yet another very thorough discussion of the cigarette tax stamping process, and we will continue to update our cigarette tax toolkit on our VACo website as more information becomes available. This session has been recorded and it will be added to the webpage as well. SICPA contact information is available there, and we are happy to field any questions for you here at VACo, either Katie or myself. So
So Carrie, I might just add to that, we developed a website, www.mytaxstamp.com. So any interested parties, you can go on there. You can actually, from that website, submit, I'm interested, and it'll kick off an email to our customer service group. I'd like to order stamps, it'll kick off an email. So there are resources there and interactive features there on stamp inquiry and request stamps. If you need further information, and as I know this is being recorded, I'll also put our information here. So if you need more information about tax stamps, I'm happy to do presentations to you or any of your interested stakeholders around tax stamping. What are the considerations? What are the impacts? And what tools are available at your invitation. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. And then we have also our customer service organization that will support you as you move into the implementation of these programs.
Well, we would like to conclude today's session with, thanking Alex and Katie for your time and your sharing your body of knowledge with us. And as you all know, you can reach out to us. You can go to our website and resource all this information. And we wish you well in your endeavors, and we hope you have a wonderful day, and we thank everyone for attending.